Good day and welcome back to our special podcast series, The New Germany, brought to you by Körber-Stiftung and part of our History and Politics podcast. This is Florian Bigge and we are at the halfway mark of our journey, episode 4 out of 6, where we delve deep into the economic heartbeat of Germany. We are delighted to welcome Monika Schnitzer, the chair of the German Council of Economic Experts and professor of comparative economics at the Ludwig-Maximilians University, Munich. She joins our wonderful hosts Katja Hoyer and Oliver Moody. Dear listeners, until next time and have a wonderful day.
Here, the whole sky is smoke. It connects all the towns. It hangs in a grey pall over the land that has made it, and that continues to make more of it. The wind that might scatter it is choked and buried under it. The sun that might tunnel through it is deflected and buried in thick clouds. By the mere fact of producing it, we worship it. We create it with an industry that is more than reverence. We are filled by it. A holy expanse of greater and lesser conurbations linked by rails, wires, interests, and surrounded by smoke, cut off from the rest of the country.
I take it you enjoyed your holiday to Dortmund?
Do you know what? I've never actually been to Dortmund, although from what I hear, it contains what is supposedly the world's most beautiful coal mine and a facility where you can turn up, you pay your €150 and you get to smash up a car with a crowbar for 60 minutes, which sounds more like your kind of holiday.
Well, there isn't much to do in Norfolk, to be fair, so, I'll have to take what entertainment I can get.
But that quote was from the Austrian writer Josef Roth, who visited the Ruhr in 1926. And given that the skies over the region are still fragranced by the enormous Datteln 4 coal-fired power station next to Dortmund, which came online only 3 years ago, it does feel like a neat way into today's topic, which is industry and deindustrialisation.
Well, that sounds like the worst Jane Austen novel ever.
I do kind of like the idea of Herr Darcy living the high life of his inherited BASF stocks.
Well, in that case, buckle up for plenty of Pride and Prejudice as we return to The New Germany, a special series for the Körber-Stiftung's History and Politics podcast, where we look under the bonnet of the Industriestandort Deutschland. I'm Katja Hoyer, a German-British historian and author based in the UK.
And I'm Oliver Moody, a British journalist in Berlin.
These days, it's barely possible to open a German newspaper or business magazine without running into the term Deindustrialisierung, the decline of industry. You could easily get the impression that Germany is some sort of Fordian paradise lost, where every one person spends 16 hours a day toiling in a widget factory and now stands to lose it all when the whole circus upstakes to China. Is that in any way true?
Not really. Germany is overwhelmingly a services economy. About 18 to 30% of its GDP comes from industry. That's depending on who's counting and what exactly they're counting. And the sector employs about 27 or 28% of the German workforce, which is, bigger than in France, Italy, Britain or the US, but pretty normal by Central European standards. Although it is big enough that when industry is in trouble, the wider economy starts to look a bit peaky too. German industry is unusually exposed to the caprices of global markets in at least 3 ways. First, it imports a lot of raw materials, energy and components from other countries. Second, it does a lot of the actual manufacturing in other countries. That's predominantly its Central European neighbours, but also quite a lot in North America and a slightly lesser amount in China and other parts of Asia's Pacific Rim. And third, Germany leans very heavily on exports to other countries, which primarily means cars, machinery, chemicals, electronics and pharmaceuticals in that order. And yeah, it's going through a rough time. Industrial production has fallen by 3 or 4% over the past year, which is worse than in France or the UK. If you look at the subsectors I mentioned, pretty much all of them are facing significant headwinds. The car makers are struggling with the shift to electromobility. China overtook Germany in machinery exports a couple of years ago. And pretty much all of these branches of industry have to contend with high energy costs, labour shortages, and the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which offers companies substantial subsidies as they shift production to the US. But that said, it is hard to tell how much deindustrialization is actually happening in the sense of industrial capacity either being shut down or moving to other parts of the world. There have been a handful of high-profile bankruptcies, most obviously among car part manufacturers, and the massive chemicals conglomerate BASF has said it's going to take a large part of its production out of Germany. If you read the sentiment surveys in industry, about a third of the companies say they're thinking of doing something similar, but I haven't yet seen any convincing quantitative evidence that they're actually following through on it yet. So given that industry barely makes up a quarter of the German economy, why do you think it has acquired such an outsized significance in the public imagination?
Well, I think it probably goes back to my favorite century, which is the 19th, where I think because Germany was so late to the table in terms of sort of the Industrial Revolution that had kicked off elsewhere, particularly in Britain and in France, it's sort of acquired a special status, I think, in the German mind, where it's directly connected in a way to what Germany is. I mean, it required the country to unify as a country in 1871 for the industry to come together and produce the enormous amount of wealth that Germany experienced at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th. And without unification, the industry couldn't have achieved that. You basically have, for instance, very necessary resources in the far west of Germany, in the rural region with coal and iron. But a lot of the workforce lived elsewhere. The capital, of course, Berlin, was elsewhere. So, in order to kind of pull that all together, the country had to unify. So I think there's something in the German psyche that connects industry and wealth and Germanness all in kind of one vague concept in a way. And that's all linked in with certain values or attributes that are perceived to be particularly German. So you have this idea of Fleiss, of this hard-working, honest graft kind of concept that is deeply entrenched, I think, with the idea of Germanness itself. So I think all of that came together, and when in 1871 Germany did unify, you have this massive so-called Second Industrial Revolution going on in Germany, which then propelled the nation towards prosperity that was, hitherto unseen. I think at the same time as well, because you get a lot of urbanization and the kind of growth of a sort of urban proletariat with that, it's also heavily connected with some kind of parts of German politics. That's particularly, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, that's intrinsically rooted in this kind of tradition. You got the trade unions coming out of that, internal migrations of people moving about within Germany and thereby pulling the nation together in some way. So all of these things, I think, are very deeply interconnected with Germany itself. And I think people sometimes have the perhaps irrational fear that once that goes or it disintegrates, there's a part of Germany itself that's lost. I think that's part of the thinking behind this kind of angst around the industrialization.
If we go forward to the post-war era, the political theorist Hannah Arendt, who'd had to flee Germany for America in 1933 because she was Jewish, returned for the first time in 1950, and she wrote a fantastically evocative essay about it for Commentary magazine when she got back. And one of the things she fastened onto was what she called an atmosphere of feverish busyness in that era of reconstruction. So she wrote, "Beneath the surface, the German attitude to work has undergone a deep change. The old virtue of seeking excellence in the finished product, no matter what the working conditions, has yielded to a mere blind need to keep busy, a greedy craving for something to do every moment of the day. Watching the Germans busily stumble through the ruins of 1,000 years of their own history, shrugging their shoulders at the destroyed landmarks, or resentful when reminded of the deeds of horror that haunt the whole surrounding world, one comes to realise that busyness has become their chief defence against reality." So what happened next?
Well, that busyness that Arendt described there very quickly turned into an almost miraculous recovery, as many observers commented at the time. So the fact that Germany had not only kind of morally completely bankrupted itself in Nazism, but also economically, should have meant that recovery, was kind of slow and struggling. I mean, observers looked at a bombed, completely dejected country that seemed to have no way out of the rubble. And suddenly, though, in the 1950s, you get this Wirtschaftswunder, the so-called economic miracle, unfolding, which pretty quickly makes Germany once again, West Germany that is, once again one of the most, so prosperous countries, much to the chagrin of other countries like Britain, for example, where, of course, the fact is bemoaned that the country was Britain that is, was on its knees economically, still doing rationing much longer than elsewhere, and it kind of looked to West Germany, which had recovered very quickly. This is partially due to Marshall Aid, so West Germany does get American help with that, but it doesn't get as much, for example, as Britain does, and it's kind of only part really of this economic recovery. I think other interesting aspects of that is that it really very heavily, once again, is sort of steeped in this industrial tradition. So one of the things that politicians quickly realize is that they will have another kind of class struggle on their hands, as happened before, if they don't change anything about the kind of trajectory where you have basically factory owners and people work in the factories. And so they try to come up with a system where there's more contribution of the workers. So, for example, it's made compulsory that you have a worker's voice on boards and in decision-making within industry. And this leads to a kind of very strong positions for the unions, but also one that is kind of in a mood or in a modus operandi where it's cooperating with big business rather than kind of completely antagonistic. So going forward, that sort of created an atmosphere whereby workers felt valued, they got paid reasonably well, they got good conditions compared to workers elsewhere in Europe, and kind of combined that led to quite a good recovery rate in the 50s and in the 60s. You also get the so-called Mittelstand, so the lower middle classes basically re-emerging, small business and so on, but also all the big businesses that really, again, were heavily involved with Nazism and should have economically and morally been damaged by this, but they also come back. Companies like Siemens, IG Farben, BASF, the car makers and so on. I mean, even Hitler's Volkswagen, Hitler's people's car, makes a miraculous recovery and reinvention and becomes in the form of the Volkswagen Beetle, the hippie car really of the early post-war era. So it's quite a remarkable turnaround, with the emphasis still very much on the hard sciences, technical education and all of that. So in a way, Germany steeps itself once again in the traditions that it's seen before the war.
One of my favourite German industry facts is that BASF's absolutely enormous chemicals conglomerate based in Ludwigshafen is also one of Germany's largest wine dealers. Because back when the company founded this factory on the banks of the Rhine at the start of the 20th century, the place was just a hamlet. And in order to attract workers, who many of whom had their own vineyards kind of off in the Pfalz or whatever, they had to build a wine cellar. And so now Ludwigshafen has grown into a city of 170,000 people. And under the BASF headquarters, there are 4 stories of sprawling underground wine vaults containing about 1 million bottles. And since we're talking about labour migration, I think it's really important to bring in the Gastarbeiter or guest workers, because from 1955 to the recruitment stop in 1973, about 14 million people came from other countries. Initially, it was mainly Italy, Greece and Spain, and then it was Yugoslavia, and in particular it was Turkey in the 1960s, for stints of industrial work in West Germany. And often they were lodged in barracks and kept pretty segregated from the native population. And I read that one of the early dormitories for Italians had a list of rules that featured the words "it is forbidden" 97 times. It's forbidden to lie in bed with your clothes on. It's forbidden to put up pictures on the walls. And my favourite, it is forbidden to turn on the light unless you have first opened the curtains.
Yeah, I mean, even when I was a kid, there was still a saying that switch off the lights, it will help win the war.
Really?
So that's one of those things that's very entrenched, I think, in the German psyche still, that you don't waste electricity. But it's interesting that they even prescribed this to the Gastarbeiter coming in.
But unloved as they were, these Gastarbeiter really were to a significant degree the human fuel that powered the Wirtschaftswunder. And that reliance on attracting skilled and not that expensive foreign labour really runs deep in Germany today still.
That's true. I think another aspect that was incredibly important to Germany's sort of industrial recovery is energy. I mean, that was an issue beforehand as well, but of course after the war and when you get a different kind of economy that's really reliant on things like electricity production and so on, you do need a constant supply of energy to fuel that. And of course, as West Germany was sort of cut off really from the east, there was an immediate kind of way of thinking around, well, where can we get sort of cheap oil and gas from? And is it possible to get it from the Soviet Union, even though, of course, that's ideologically on the other side? But when relations improved between East and West under Willy Brandt in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were many deals struck, and basically cheap energy came in and fueled this economy further. And this basically was, of course, perpetuated more famously now with the Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 pipelines, where slowly first coal and then nuclear energy was phased out in favor of this cheap oil and gas coming from the Soviet Union and later from Russia. And that, of course, meant, especially once the Soviet Union collapsed, and we had this kind of era of the supposedly end of history where these things didn't matter anymore, that Germany could effectively rely on very cheap energy coming from Russia at this point without having to, at the same time, spend huge amounts on the military and on security, or that's at least the thinking that was there at the time. So there was this period really throughout the 1990s and early 2000s where the conditions were almost ideal for the industry in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to get a bit hung up on the gas shock from early 2022, but I think what we're talking about here is something broader and deeper. So in November 2023, the so-called Five Sages, or Wirtschaftsweise, a group of leading economists who make up the German government's advisory council, put out a pretty stark warning that the country's medium-term growth prospects were the lowest they'd been since records began in the modern era. And we'll be hearing more about the reasons behind that verdict from the chief sage herself in a minute. But it's basically clear that a lot of the problems confronting German industry are not just a blip brought about by the pandemic or the energy crunch of the past couple of years. They are structural. And these are things like shortages of skilled labour, inadequate green electricity production, the burden of bureaucracy, neglect of physical and digital infrastructure, and the lost ground on key technologies such as batteries, semiconductors, and AI. And that last one is especially galling, I think, because German universities have produced many of the modern world's greatest computer scientists, including leading figures at Google and Salesforce. It's just that they aren't working in Germany anymore.
So one would presume that government is trying to do something about all of this?
Well, Katja, that's quite a risque question because for some reason there is this very persistent notion that Germany doesn't do industrial policy, that the kind of central precept of Ordnungspolitik and the social market economy is that the state does the state stuff and business does the business stuff. And if you look at the amount of winner-picking and industrial back-scratching that actually happened under Konrad Adenauer or Ludwig Erhard, I think you could definitely question that idea. But to answer the question, yeah, obviously the government has been aware of these issues for some time. And back in 2019, the business minister Peter Altmaier, who we spoke to in the first episode of this series, The New Germany, actually published 2 industrial strategies. The first one, quite controversially, set a target to grow industry's share of GDP and to put big national champions such as Siemens or ThyssenKrupp under the protection of the state, while the second, after a bit of an outcry from business, instead proposed blocking foreign investments in sensitive high technology sectors such as robotics or quantum computing. And the current government under Olaf Scholz has also gone in for industrial policy in a big, big way. There's been a lot of attention paid to the multi-billion-pound subsidies that have been handed to Tesla to build a gigafactory in Grünheide on the outskirts of Berlin. and to Intel to build a giant chip factory in Magdeburg. But there is still this very central dilemma that I don't think has been entirely resolved, which is how you balance the interests of the big industrial conglomerates against the Mittelstand and then the startups that could really prove to be Germany's future.
Well, there are certainly lots of conflicting interests here and also conflicting solutions for this. But if there's one consistent lesson from the past, it's that German industry has traditionally shown a remarkable ability to change with the times and bounce back out of even the deepest conundrums. So for a guide of how it might pull off this feat again, we are very fortunate to have an expert guest who is not only one of the leading authorities on the subject, but also has the ear of Olaf Scholz, if only he will listen.
Our expert guest today is Monika Schnitzer, Professor of Economics and Chair of Comparative Economics at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. Professor Schnitzer has studied at the universities of Cologne and Bonn and at the London School of Economics, followed by visiting professorships at Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and the University of California at Berkeley. Her research has focused primarily on competition policy, innovation, and multinational firms. In 2020, she was appointed to the German Council of Economic Experts, which is colloquially known as the Wirtschaftsweise, or Five Sages, who provide advice to the federal government and have done so since 1963, including a very interesting annual State of the Nation report. And in 2022, Professor Schnitzer became chairwoman of the council. In November 2023, she and her fellow sages published a much-discussed report that warned of bleak prospects for Germany's long-term growth and a need for structural reform. Professor Schnitzer, we are delighted to welcome you to the New Germany podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Great, then let's straight dive in. What exactly do we mean when we talk about deindustrialization in Germany's case, and to what extent has it actually happened up to now?
Well, let me start by saying that Germany still has a relatively large industrial base, relatively compared to other countries in a similar development stage. So typically, other countries rely more on service industry. In Germany, it's still a lot of manufacturing. Like 20% of our GDP is due to manufacturing, to industry, really. So we have significant still base of manufacturing, heavy industries in the overall economic structure. This has been threatened already by import competition, say, from China. And now with the start of the Russian war in the Ukraine and the subsequent stop of gas delivery from Russia to Germany, the energy supply is under high pressure and the prices went up dramatically. And this is what has raised the concern that German industry will no longer be able to survive with these high energy prices, in particular because we have a lot of energy-intensive industries, such as chemical, paper industries, manufacture of basic metals. All these rely a lot on energy. Now, to be fair, we have to say that the industry has responded quite well. So they did make adjustments already, saving energy and to the extent that they can, raising sales prices. So actually, most of them will be able to survive and do quite well. And those who won't because of the high energy prices, well, they need to restructure. And one way of restructuring is to do a similar thing that we do with labor-intensive products. We are a country with high labor costs, so we import the labor-intensive products into Germany and then use them to produce very high-value products that we then export to the rest of the world. The same will need to happen to high energy-intensive products, so that we don't produce our own ammonia anymore, say, but rather import it from other countries where energy is much cheaper and will continue to be much cheaper, and then still produce the high-value chemical products that we can then sell to the rest of the world.
There are a number of structural conundrums facing the German government here, and one of the biggest ones that follows from what you just said is how much public borrowing or public money to spend on subsidies to shield German industry from rising energy prices and to support industrial projects such as chip making and green steel, because the gap in energy prices between Germany and some of its big competitors, notably China and the US, is very large. It's not likely to get much smaller in the next few years. And obviously, without wanting to relitigate the budget crisis at the end of 2023, the Constitutional Court has imposed a set of fiscal constraints that make this kind of thing a lot harder to do in the future. So, in the grand scheme of things, how much longer can this approach go on, and what parts of it might have to give way?
Okay, let me start by saying that in times of crisis, and the energy crisis we had last year, or that started last year with the war in the Ukraine, then of course the government can take an exception rule from the debt brake, and in this case then use debt to help companies. And they did this during the corona pandemic, and they definitely also did it last year with the energy crisis. But this cannot go on forever, in particular not when we are in the medium and long-term equilibrium. And as you just emphasized, the high energy prices are here to stay. Or to put it differently, energy prices are going down. We see that already. But the price differential to the rest of the world, in particular to the US, say, which benefits from fracking, or to Norway, say, because they have this water supply, can use renewable energy. So the price differential to these countries, this is here to stay. And that means we will need to adapt our industry structure, as I just explained before. So this is definitely not something that we can overcome by simply going to subsidize in the short, medium, long term. And therefore, we shouldn't. I mean, this is a question that is heavily debated in Germany. Some advocate that, well, we should make the transition easier for companies, so to build a bridge, say, to the future, where then energy prices have come down. But the bottom line still needs to be there is a price differential that's going to stay. And the companies that cannot live with this price differential, they should restructure. And that means one shouldn't subsidize them with subsidized energy price.
In your latest annual report, you and your fellow economic sages said that Germany's growth potential for the medium term was at a Tiefstand. I guess you'd translate that as nadir or something like that. You've already talked about some of the factors holding it back. Competition from imports, energy prices, but what are the other really big factors that are weighing on your mind when you make this kind of judgment?
Yes, so let me start by putting a number on what you just said, that the growth potential is really at an idea. We expect the potential output to grow over the next couple of years only by 0.4% per year, which is really just a third of the average growth rate that we had in the years 2010 and the years thereafter. So that is really low, and this is what we project if the current dynamics are unchanged and simply continue like that. So what is behind this low number? First and foremost, perhaps it's the decrease in labor volume. It's demographic change. The baby boomers are going to retire over the next couple of years, and so we will lose a lot of the labor force that's currently driving our economy. And unless we have reforms such as increasing the pension, the retirement age, or making women work longer hours, or having an inflow of migrants, then we still have to live with this lower volume of labor. And that definitely restricts growth, and not just growth overall, but also growth per capita, because it's not that the demographics as such is reduced, so it's not that the population size is reduced that much. It's simply that a much larger part of our population will be pensioners. who need to be supported by a much lower number of working age people, and that will be a decisive factor. Another factor that is common in more or less all countries now is that we have a decline in the growth of productivity. Productivity growth used to be much higher. It has been declining for years, for decades even. And unless we boost this productivity, again, we are in for a very low growth in the future. So here we can discuss whether AI will help us. Definitely that is some prospect, but we will need to put it to good use. And again, we can discuss this as we go along. Third dimension is investment. Also, investment has been rather low in Germany compared to other countries. The whole capital stock is actually rather old compared to other countries. And we have much fewer young, innovative startups as other countries than other countries do. So these are the three main ingredients: labor volume, productivity growth, investment. And for some, it's easier to change things than for others, but definitely we will have to work on all three dimensions.
And with these deep structural problems, which specific parts of the German industrial sector risk becoming basically fundamentally uncompetitive in the medium and in the long run?
I mean, everybody is affected by the shortage of skilled workers. Actually, it's not just skilled workers, it's workers in general that we are lacking now. But the technical change or the technological change affects the different industries to a different extent. And therefore, there will be challenges unless these industries reform themselves. Let me start with the heavyweight in German industry. It's the automotive manufacturing. Germany relies to a large extent on automotive manufacturing because this is also the export hit that Germany has. So the challenges for the automotive industry is that we see a lot of technological changes. So the industry used to be extremely successful in building and selling combustion engine cars. But the future is in electric vehicles. The future is in autonomous driving. The future is in a larger part of the value being produced or being due to software that goes into the car. And here, German manufacturers have been less at the forefront of the development, or maybe they have developed stuff, but they haven't put it into the market yet. And here the competition from China is a real challenge. So in terms of electric cars, in particular small cars, China is now a real important competitor. And the question is whether German manufacturers will be able to adapt to that and face this challenge. Another industry that is affected by technological changes is heavy machinery and equipment. It relies still a lot on traditional manufacturing methods, with not so much embracing advanced technologies such as automation, artificial intelligence, data analytics. There's a lot of talk about Internet of Things, and as a former economic minister said, okay, the US has the internet, we in Germany have the things, but Germany hasn't been able to really put this together in the sense of making use of the data it produces with its things, such as to develop new business models and making the whole construction much more productive. Let me turn to the third really important part of German industry, that's basic chemical production. This is exactly the sector that is now very much challenged by the high energy prices, also by environmental regulations and an increasing emphasis on sustainability. So here, the industry will need to transform itself, adapt to the higher energy prices, by more outsourcing of the really energy-intensive products. And at the same time, putting a really strong emphasis on innovation, because with innovation, they could actually not just reinvent themselves, but also contribute to sustainability by producing new materials that are more efficient, by producing materials, for instance, that help building batteries or that rely less on critical raw materials. So here is a real innovation potential, and hopefully the industry will pick this up.
I know some German politicians still worry that industrial policy is a bit of a dirty phrase in this country. But I would like to ask about the role the government might play here, aside from not getting in the way of this restructuring in those parts of industry you were talking about. Is there a case that it should be more actively involved in others and trying to give more incentives towards innovation, not just at established players in the market, but also at sort of up-and-coming or newer companies?
You mentioned, and that is really exactly the critical issue here. There used to be a focus on industrial policy that was more or less simply just supporting the heavyweights that we have already. But the industrial policy was not geared towards fostering the development of new companies. And that is exactly what we need, because technologies are changing. We need new companies that embrace new technologies, that put this to the forefront and make this profitable. And by focusing too much on the old industries, in a way, we prevent the reallocation of factors that is needed from less productive older ones to more productive newer ones. So an industrial policy that helps promote these new technologies and these new companies, that is something that is worthwhile. Let me use one example now that was heavily debated in Germany. Is it a good idea to subsidize companies, chip producers to come to Germany? Intel has been chosen to be subsidized. TSMC will receive a subsidy in order to lure it to Germany, so to build a chip manufacturing site.
TSMC being the big Taiwanese microchip manufacturer.
Exactly. And that can be justified by two reasons. One is to really focus on new industries. It's not a completely new technology, of course, but something that Germany has been much less involved than it should be, perhaps. Also because it was so cheap to resource this from other countries, Taiwan, as you just mentioned. But in times of geopolitical tensions, it may be not a good idea to be so much reliant and dependent on other suppliers, in particular from Asia. So this is an industrial policy that, on the one hand, focuses on products that we do need, that are at the technological frontier, and at the same time that are strategically important, where we want to be less dependent. So I think that is an industrial policy that can be well justified.
In some way, people have tried to reduce this dependency somewhat by diversifying import and export so that people don't rely, or Germany doesn't rely specifically on one particular market. How much progress has Germany already made on that front in terms of diversifying its export markets and its sources of strategically important imports, and what more does it need to do in this area?
So in terms of exports, I don't see that a lot of diversification has happened. In terms of imports, companies do now start to diversify their sources more, trying to source their inputs from other countries. One problem there might be they may source it from other countries in Asia, and these countries then source themselves from China. So in the end, how completely independent we get by doing this kind of diversification is not clear. Another way of diversifying has been, or at least is discussed and planned, is by producing more in Europe ourselves, in particular when it comes to critical raw materials. We used to import this a lot from China. And to the extent that we do not want to become that dependent, or that we don't want to stay that dependent on China anymore, it makes a lot of sense to try to, at least to some extent, to produce these raw materials, these critical raw materials in Europe ourselves. There has been the EU Critical Raw Material Acts that goes direct in that direction. We have a free trade agreement now with Canada or Chile, for instance, to source lithium. So these efforts go in the right direction. One should say these efforts should be really coordinated at the European level. It doesn't make much sense if every country there has its own strategy, well, perhaps one that supplements the European one, but not that substitutes for the European efforts. One also has to say that in a few critical sectors, the opportunities to develop our own sources, our own resources are limited if you don't have the deposits. Well, there is no mining that we can do. In this case, we also need to focus more on substitution, on technological progress, on innovation, as I was just mentioning this for the chemical industry. So here, research development of alternative materials, alternative business models, they should be intensified.
These conversations can often take quite a pessimistic turn, which totally isn't your fault. I mean, we're the ones asking the questions. But I guess a part of fixing these problems has to be to set out a credible vision of what German industry might look like in a prosperous scenario 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. So when Olaf Scholz sets out this idea of a green jobs revolution, what do you think that really means, and what kind of form could it credibly take?
I think to the extent that we manage to really move towards a climate protecting industry, using more renewable energies, this, of course, creates jobs that will foster this. And we see that actually, that it has been going on. So in 2021, for instance, the companies in the manufacturing sectors, they spent already more than 4 billion euros on avoiding emissions, on conserving resources. And that number means that within 10 years, they have increased their investment by 75%. So we see more investment in that direction, and we see more jobs in that direction. So according to the recent figures, we have more than 340,000 people that now are employed in the production of goods and services for environmental protection, so-called green jobs, as you just mentioned. So again, this represents a year-on-year increase of almost 10% over a 10-year period. And according to the statistics, around 2/3 of all the green jobs that we have now are in the manufacturing sector. So that is definitely something that proves that there is some renewal going on, and we will have more green jobs. At the same time, let me also say what we will see is at some point less manufacturing, more service sector production. And the question then is, how much will this service sector contribute to our GDP? How many well-paid jobs will be offered by this digital, by the service sector? And this is one of the foci we should have for the future. Not just rely on high energy intensive manufacturing, but being able to produce good jobs, well-paid jobs in the service sector as well.
And that's, of course, a huge challenge. And you're in the delicate business of posing these challenges to the government and proposing solutions to them. Does the government or, kind of politicians, do they always listen to your advice, act on it? And does it ever become frustrating telling them these things?
So I'm not a person that is easily frustrated. And if I were, I would have this job, because it is indeed not the case that you put out suggestions and then they say, oh, well, we have waited for that, so let's do it right away. No, we are fully aware that there's always a political discussion. I mean, we propose suggestions, we analyze the situation, point towards weaknesses and challenges, and propose suggestions based on economic analysis and with economic considerations, but not with political considerations. This is the job of the politicians. They will have to take into account a lot more topics, a lot more dimensions than the ones that we have in mind, because we are considering the economic considerations. That is our job. Having said that, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no influence, just to the contrary. We are a lot in contact with people from the government, from the administration of the government. There is a very intensive exchange, in particular in times of crisis. So during the corona pandemic, what is it that we can do to help companies and the people in times of the energy crisis? So in times of crisis, there is a lot of discussion, also because there is not a blueprint how to deal with this kind of crisis. And so all the efforts that are available, all the insights, all the expertise that is available is put together, and everybody tries their best to come up with sensible solutions. As a council also, I should say, we are in the privileged position that the government actually has to respond to our proposal. So it's stipulated by law that it must comment on how it has dealt with our proposals in the annual economic report by the government. And so there is a basis for having a discussion and making sure that they don't simply overlook, neglect what we say. And in general, I should say that using the experience from the past, some of our proposals do find their way into political programs or legislations, sometimes not immediately, but after a couple of years. But you will find quite a few suggestions that in the end had a basis in what the Council wrote in its reports.
Well, we look forward very much to seeing how that discussion continues. Professor Schnitzer, thank you for doing such a beautifully clear job of navigating us through this very complicated and sensitive territory.
It's my pleasure.
And that concludes this week's episode. Please do join us next time when we will be talking about Germany's social transformation from immigration to sex and gender.
Thank you to our listeners for, listening. And as always, if you have enjoyed this podcast, do recommend it to your friends, family, colleagues, neighbours, pets, tax advisors. If you haven't, you can, of course, tell us how we messed up over Twitter or X. We are at Hoyer_Cat and at Oliver N. Moody.
Thanks as always to the Körber-Stiftung and their history and politics team for all the support and hard work.
Viele Grüße aus Berlin.
And keep you a trushing, as they say in Norfolk. Goodbye.